Greetings, my excellent friend. Welcome to the Heavy Metal History Report.
Hello, listener. I'm your host, Dustin, and this is Heavy Metal History. Welcome to our second episode of the podcast, where we are going to finish up where we left off, going into the history of the band that started it all, Black Sabbath. On this episode, we're going to be finishing up starting at 1975 and going through until 1980. And hopefully our episodes will pick up from there and we'll go chronologically a little bit, talk about some albums that were out in 1980. But for this episode, we're just going to finish up with the rest of the band's discography up to that point, all the changes, and man, what a ride. So the first record that we're going to get into here, we're going to talk about Technical Ecstasy. It was recorded June of 1976 and released September 25th of 1976. And the lineup for this record would be Ozzy Osborne on vocals, Tony Iommi on guitar, Geezer Butler on bass guitar, Bill Ward on drums, and lead vocals on the track It's Alright. Additional personnel was Gerald Jez Woodruff on keyboards, and he was credited as Gerald Woodruff. So, kind of where we left off with the band is they were going through all these legal battles with Sabotage, and it kind of messed up that recording session a little bit. You know, there's a lot of different things going on with the band at that time, and maybe creatively they weren't all there, but at the same time you can kind of say they were, because they did write the first thrash metal song ever, so kind of depends on how you look at it. So what they did with this record is they chose Miami's Criteria Studios to go make Technical Ecstasy, and that kind of continued the band's separation from like the doom and darkness that had been a trademark of their earlier albums. And speaking of that, Tony Iommi says, you know, some people may have heard the band in 1970 and be thinking, oh no, not them again. But if they heard us now, they probably might like us. And even then, according to Bill Ward, Technical Ecstasy also found Sabbath starting to feel the considerable effects of years of hard and reckless living, you know, like all the drug use, all the touring. He says that we'd done such a lot of touring by the time Technical Ecstasy was written and recorded, there was some wear and tear on the band. So, you know, if you've been listening to this episode and the previous one, the band has just been through so much in this short amount of time. I mean, they skyrocketed to the spot that they're at right now, and it must have been hard on them to like still want to like make albums and tour and, you know, try to have like a normal life outside of that. But despite that fact, you know, to record this album, the band did go to Criteria Studios, like I said, and they actually would often bump into fellow musicians like Mick Fleetwood or Andy Gibb, and it was a location as far removed from the group's humble beginnings in England as you can imagine. Bill, speaking of the studio, he says that Criteria was becoming a popular studio. We were always looking at what advancements were being made at a particular studio technically, and we also had an opportunity to kind of live in a quieter world where we could all get some sleep, where we were always looking for a place of refuge. And in general, all of us had the idea that if we moved to somewhere that's comfortable, we'd write better or we'd play better. And I don't know if that's, you know, just him musing kind of poetically about the situation, you know, just being like, yeah, in hindsight, maybe that's what we thought, but it didn't really work out that way, because nearly the entirety of Technical Ecstasy reflected a huge shift from the heavy metal genre to like this more radio-friendly hard rock sound. You have strings. They have a string section on the song She's Gone, and while more than a few moments on the record could have found like a really comfortable spot on a foreign record, Ward kind of explains how the new sound and direction developed. And he says that, I think it was something that happened as the process moved along. As far as I know, we've never been a band that's gone, oh, let's do this. We didn't design it and then go in and play it. It's always been something that actually shows up whenever we get together. It's like, what's going to show up and how's it going to be? So in hindsight, and just thinking about Florida and the way it was pretty laid back. That could have easily reflected, in part, the way some of this music came about. And looking at it now, I can see where it may have had some influence on the musical ending of that album. There are definitely departure points that I think were quite risque, but at the time it all seemed to fit perfectly okay. To me, we seemed okay with it. I wasn't aware of any grumblings that we'd gone too far left or right and we weren't the same band that we used to be. I think there was some unique playing on some of the tracks. It sometimes reminds me of a band that's been working so hard and they become a little tired, which happens to a lot of people. They become more laid back, or they need to breathe in longer or rest longer. And so he kind of, really sums up the feeling of the record. It's a little bit more laid back, a little more, or even a lot more subdued from the early years. There's not that angst and anger and, I guess, pushback, of trying to be something different. It was more about going along with the flow at this point. It was a huge risk to do that, but the fact that, at this point in their career, they can do that, I think is really bold on their part. The thing about this record too, the lighter approach that we were talking about, it's really felt throughout the album, and a lot of the distortion is largely replaced with piano and keyboards, which would be courtesy of Gerald Woodruff there. And Ward explains like how he kind of became in the band. He says that we needed a keyboard player, and Jez was a friend of mine. We were adding more and more stuff to our music. We were doing more stringy things, and we needed extra support. I got the job to ask Jez. I said, would you like to play with the Sabs and see how it goes? He joined, and I think he had a very hard entrance into becoming part of the band. He was teased a lot at times, and my heart went out to him. It was like, oh my God, give the guy a break. But he actually did very, very well. He's a very, very good musician. I think the work he did with Robert Plant was excellent, and he's a nice guy. I was a friend with him way before he happened with Sabbath. So this is another moment, where the band's trying to experiment and branch out into different territories and sounds. And, Bill Ward had this friend who was a keyboard player, and it just kind of happened. It fit. It was supposed to happen, I guess. And, the keyboard parts are pretty cool. It's definitely an interesting addition to the band and their sound. It's not like they haven't experimented with it before, Ozzy having the Mellotron and stuff like that, or a Moog. But it definitely kind of molds into that ambiance of being a lighter record, because the keyboards are very bright and happy sounding almost. And one other little thing here that Bill Ward talks about, he talks about the song It's Alright, which is a very Beatles-esque song. And speaking about writing and having this song, he says, way before Technical Ecstasy, I had a song called It's Alright. I first recorded it at Field Farm Way back in the early 70s, along with a lot of other stuff as well that I've still got lying around somewhere. And I never thought any more of it. I just liked the song and we recorded it. I never dreamed for 1 second that it would end up on a Black Sabbath record. And at the time, I might have had aspirations of maybe one day making a solo album, which is what I think everybody goes through in a rock and roll band. But we were just writing as individuals as well as collectively as a band that jammed together. And we were all growing as musicians, and this track had been around for a long time. I'd play it every once in a while when we were in the studio, or I'd sing it if we were in the car, and the guys in the band really liked it. They said, oh, that's a great song, Bill, and that's as far as it went. And I think at the time of the recording of Technical Ecstasy, we were 1 or 2 songs short, so It's Alright came up as an idea to put on the album. I felt really, really nervous about it because it was something that's private to me. It's kind of like some of the softer songs that I write, Light Up the Candles, off his 1990 solo album, or other ththings that I've written over the years. I have that in me as well. I do like to write soft melodies and things like that, and It's Alright would be part of me that likes to write the softer songs, but the idea came up. I don't know who suggested it. I think it might have been Ozzy, but I'm not sure. At the time, I think it was he who suggested I sing it as well, which I felt really uncomfortable with. I felt really uncomfortable with the idea of me singing on a Sabbath album. It didn't feel right. But eventually, I stepped up to the post and did the best I could in singing the song. In hindsight, the whole thing felt a little bit awkward for me. I liked the outcome. I thought, well, that sounds really good. I like what Tony did in the huge guitar solo. I had the bass drum part in the middle worked out, but when we were trying to mix it, I asked Mick Fleetwood to give me his ear and listen to the bass drum because I got really tied up with it in terms of, is it sonically okay? Is it too loud, or does it need an extra dB or minus dB? And I remember asking Mick if he could listen to it, and he was really a gentleman. He was actually quite amicable about listening to it and giving his thoughts to it. Now, definitely that song is a weird song on this record. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It makes no sense to be on this record, but it's there. I mean, it's a, part of it was because Ozzy started to check out. He wasn't really into doing a lot of shit, and I think he just didn't want to write another song or sing another song, so they had him do it, and well, that's the result we get, guys. It's all right. Speaking of kind of the recording process of this record, Iommi kind of talks about like the fact that the sessions were really relaxing for everyone, they were relaxing for everyone in the band except for himself, who was really left to oversee the production while the others just sunned themselves on the beach. He says that we recorded the album in Miami and nobody would take responsibility for the production. No one wanted to bring in an outside person for help, and no one wanted the whole band to produce it, so they left it all to me. Which is unfortunate, man, that, they kind of dumped all this shit on Iommi, and if you go on into their later history, you can tell it's always just Iommi taking the reins and like really trying to keep the band together no matter what. I mean, there's a couple Black Sabbath albums that I'm sure we'll talk about eventually as the podcast goes on that are just like, wow, how did this get made and why did you put your name on it? But I think it's because he loved the band so much. He didn't want to let it die. He didn't want to, he just didn't want to let it go. And I understand that aspect of it. But at the same time, you're kind of tarnishing the band's legacy there when really you should just go off and do a solo thing. Which we will kind of get to when we talk to the very last record in this episode here. So another thing, while the band was trying to finish the album, rock and metal had kind of spawned a new set of iconoclasts. You have the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, all from England. And suddenly, Black Sabbath found themselves unsure of their musical direction and kind of got labeled as has-beens. Butler kind of explains, he says that it's not like now, if you're in a heavy metal band, you put out a heavy metal album. Back then, you had to at least try to be modern and keep up. Punk was massive then, and we felt that our time had come and gone. So, the band saw that things were changing, and even they're partly responsible for it too, man. If you really think about it, they kind of like they gave rise to punk rock. And the band, I don't think really wanted to jump on a bandwagon, which is a good thing. I'm glad they didn't make like a punk rock album. That would have been really fucking weird. But lightening up their sound a little bit, I don't know if that necessarily worked either for them. So they're in this weird gray area of what to do and how they sound, and this record is kind of, this one and the next one are very much just culminations of that. But even then, to make matters worse for the band, the manager, Don Arden, began spending more of his time focusing on his other acts like ELO. So they kind of didn't have their manager around. And Iommi's determination to move Sabbath in a new direction was really misguided, according to some people. and that, you know, while future rock people like the Eagles, you know, you'd have Hotel California and Rumors were just around the corner, but to try and force that sound on Black Sabbath was like trying to put lamb's wool on a suit of armor. It just didn't work. And that's a good point, because, you know, they had this guy that was working with them trying to be like, yeah, sound like these bands. And that's, you know, they went in the wrong direction for that. But also, you can't have a guy coming in and going like, hey, sound like these punk rock bands either. And yeah, it's a recipe for disaster. So along with that, man, Ozzy was kind of on his way out a little bit. He had definitely started to consider leaving around this time, to which he says, I'd even had a t-shirt made with Blizzard of Oz written on the front. And meanwhile, in the studio, Tony was always saying, we gotta sound like Foreigner, we gotta sound like Queen. But I thought it was strange that the bands we'd once influenced were now influencing us. And that's kind of an interesting point, you know, because I don't know that Sabbath necessarily influenced Queen or Foreigner, really, because I know Queen was around the same time as Sabbath, and they were a completely different animal. But, you know, it is a good point. He makes a really good point there that, you know, the tables have kind of turned, and they're worried about everything else that's popular right now, not what they should be doing or influencing the next generation of bands. Talking about the cost of recording in Florida, Ozzy says that the cost was astronomical and that he had lost the plot with booze and drugs during the recording and eventually had to check himself into the Stafford County Asylum on his return to England, which is very, very unfortunate. And Geezer kind of like talking more about that, he says, that was the beginning of the end, that one. We were managing ourselves because we couldn't trust anybody. Everybody was trying to rip us off, including the lawyers we'd hired to get us out of our legal mess. It was really just getting to us around then, and we didn't know what we were doing. And obviously the music was suffering. You could just feel the whole thing falling apart. So even before that, you know, Ozzy briefly left during the technical Ecstasy tour, and he would eventually return for obviously Never Say Die. But during that time, the band actually replaced him with vocalist Dave Walker from Savoy Brown. And the band did write a handful of songs, which we'll get to on that next record there. But during the recording of this album, you know, they had the Eagles recording Hotel California in an adjacent studio at Criteria in Miami. So before they could even start recording that, Geezer says that they had to scrape all the cocaine out of the mixing board. I think that they left about a pound of cocaine in the board. And the Eagles were forced to stop recording on numerous occasions because Sabbath were too loud and the sound was actually coming through the wall. Now, he could just be kind of being tongue-in-cheek about that with, like, all the cocaine, but who knows, man? Who knows? It's definitely quite, quite a story there. I mean, cocaine was just so rampant in those days. What are you going to do? Now, the thing is, with this record, it's very divisive with fans. Iommi says that Black Sabbath fans generally don't like much of technical Ecstasy, and it was really a no-win situation for us. If we had stayed the same, people would have said we were still doing the same old stuff. So we tried to get a little more technical, and it just didn't work out very well. And I mean, you know, I don't know how much more technical they really got, but you know, they were trying to do something, and that's, I guess, a lot better than staying the same, like he said. You know, again, it is a good point that he makes, but how successful was it? The answer is not very, unfortunately. This is probably, I don't know, it's not the greatest album in their discography, but, you know, there are worse ones. But even in that case, you know, showcasing a different sound and vibe, this album, it does represent the final time Black Sabbath released an album without a lineup change, because as I said earlier, you know, Ozzy's kind of on his way out. They brought in Dave Walker to kind of like fill that void for a little bit, and that started more fractures in the band. And Ward even said he knew something was odd when Ozzy agreed to have him sing "It's All Right," and he says that, even though everybody was saying, yeah, that's great, let's do it, and Ozzy was like, yeah, sure, go do it, it's a good song, I didn't like the idea of replacing what could have been an Ozzy Osbourne vocal. It felt a little strange. So yeah, there's some weird stuff going on. Nobody's really communicating, and the band is just kind of like falling apart piece by piece, and they just can't really come to grips with it. But despite that, the band did go on tour. They did a 1977 European tour in support of the album, and the band was supported by AC/DC. And there's a couple little stories from that tour. Supposedly, the relationship between Geezer Butler and Malcolm Young was really tense because, as Iommi recalls, he says that the atmosphere between the two being heavy, and that pair did not get along at all. So Ward's drum tech, Graham Wright, and Osborne's personal assistant, David Tanier, talked about the problems between the two kind of originated after a show the two bands performed earlier in Switzerland. An altercation kind of occurred in a hotel bar in which Butler removed a switchblade comb from his pocket and opened it. And Young thought it was a switchblade knife and believed Butler was pointing it at him. So, to kind of speak on the other side of that, Clinton Walker, talking about that tour, he says of Sabbath that by 1976, they were all well past their prime, and AC/DC were all but blowing them off the stage. Substance abuse in the band was rampant, and, they also say that at that time, Bill Ward began driving from gig to gig in a rented Winnebago due to his fear of flying. So, obviously, they were having some problems on this tour. They were having issues with the fact that a band was doing a little better than them night to night, and, it caused a little bit of a ruckus there with that tour. So one last thing we're going to kind of cover before we move on to the next record here is the album cover. Now, I know on Sabotage I talked about the fact that it's rated as one of the worst album covers of all time, but I have to wholeheartedly disagree and say that this is their worst cover of all time. It's so fucking weird and doesn't look like a heavy metal album, but also I think the reason that it works is if you listen to the music, it kind of does match what's going on with the sounds on the record, and in that respect it works, but on every other level it's just a fucking mess. But the cover art was designed by a gentleman named Hypnosis, and Ozzy once described the cover as two robots screwing on an escalator, which he's not far off. It's pretty much what it is. And kind of, in the creation of it, Hypnosis, whose name is Storm Thorgerson, had been assisted by graphic designer George Hardy, and they discussed the album cover with a magazine in 1979, saying that we're very fond of that cover. From the title of the piece, Technical Ecstasy, I thought of something ecstatic rather than something technical, and I immediately thought of ecstasy in sexual terms, some sort of mechanical copulation, which would be tricky to do. I then thought of ecstasy as falling in love, perhaps during a brief encounter on an escalator, and since it was technical, I thought of two robots. It's really quite simple. He's just done curves for the female and hard, angular, macho lines for the male. It's really quite sexist, actually, stereotyped. Anyway, it's love at first sight, but I felt robots wouldn't do it like humans would do it, so instead they're squirting lubricating fluid at one another. So yeah, that sums up what that record cover looks like. It's definitely, I don't think like the way he was explaining it, with like it being all about sex and love and everything, encapsulates what the songs are about in any way, shape, or form. So I think, in that respect, he kind of missed the mark a little bit, but that is just my opinion. And with that, we're going to move on to our next record here, which is Never Say Die. This was recorded between January and May of 1978, and it was released September 28th of 1978. So the lineup for this record is Ozzy Osborne, lead vocals and backing vocals, Tony Iommi, guitar, backing vocals on the track A Hard Road, Geezer Butler, bass guitar and backing vocals on A Hard Road, Bill Ward, drums, lead vocals on Swinging the Chain, and backing vocals on A Hard Road. Now, additional musicians on this record were Don Airey on keyboards, John Elstar on harmonica on Swinging the Chain, and Will Malone with brass arrangements. So, during the time and recording of Never Say Die, the members of Black Sabbath were still all heavily involved in drug and alcohol abuse. And, prior, like I said in the previous one, prior to recording, Ozzy left the band and was temporarily replaced by Dave Walker. And kind of explaining what all happened here, Iommi, he says that we never wanted him to leave, and I think he wanted to come back, but no one would tell the other how they felt. So we had to bring in another singer and write all new material. So the band wrote a handful of songs with Walker, with that short-lived lineup even actually performing an early version of what later would become Junior's Eyes on the BBC program Look Here. Osborne eventually rejoined the band, but he refused to sing any of the songs they wrote with Walker. So right before they were supposed to record Never Say Die, they kind of, I think 2 days before they were about to record again, Ozzy decides to show up, and he didn't want to sing this stuff. So Bill had to sing on one track because Ozzy refused to sing on it. We ended up having to write in the day so we could record in the evening, and we never had time to review the tracks and make changes. So I think as a result, the album sounds very confused. So kind of elaborating a little more on that, Tony Iommi goes on to say that, Bill had to sing on one track, Swinging the Chain, because Ozzy refused to sing it, and we ended up having to write in the day so we could record in the evening. I'm just repeating myself here. I fucked up that information. Sorry, guys. I'm going to leave it in because it's funny. I mean, fuck it. Why not? When I'm sitting there typing all this stuff out, all this information that I'm looking up, it's a lot. And sometimes I'm just like reading this wall of text, and my eyes get a little sidetracked. But why cut that out? Why not just leave it? So, finally, Ozzy reconvened with the bandmates at Sound Interchange Studios in Toronto, Ontario, and tracked most of his vocals for Never Say Die. But when the final overdubs were done in May of 1978, no one was happier than the rest of the band. But even speaking to that, Iommi says, let's just say, well, it definitely wasn't our finest hour. I can tell you that. So the songs that they actually that were redone with Walker were Junior's Eyes, which was rewritten to be about the recent death of Osborne's father. Ozzy says that we had a few internal problems, and my father was dying, so that put us out there for over 3 months with the funeral and everything. I left the band for 3 months before we got back together to record it. And even with that, though, the writing was kind of on the wall that he didn't want to really be there anymore. And even Ozzy himself says that no one really talked about what had happened. I just turned up in the studio one day. I think Bill had been trying to act as a peacemaker on the phone, and that was the end of it. But it was obvious things had changed, especially between me and Tony. I don't think anyone's heart was in it anymore. And, it's unfortunate that after all this time, man, the band just finally... I mean, they'd been a band for a decade. That's a pretty long time. It's kind of hard to like be with this many people for that period of time and go through all the things that they went through and not have a little bit of animosity or, not getting along there. And just so happened to culminate on this record, which ironically is called Never Say Die. And, the band kind of in a respect did die at this point. Ozzy's about to leave. Once we get into the next record, the whole lineup just kind of shifts and morphs and changes over the period of, however many months just to get this new lineup going, and even during some tours and even recording. So it's unfortunate that this was the end for a while, at least. Eventually the band would get back together, but we're not going to talk about that just yet. Kind of talking more about the recording aspect of the record, Iommi says that we went to Toronto to record it, and that's when the problem started. Why Toronto? Because of the tax, really. The studio was booked through brochures because people thought it might be a good one. And we got there, and it had a dead sound, just totally wrong. We couldn't get a real live sound. So what we had to do was rip the carpet up and try to make it as live as we could. And they were okay about it, but it took time to get it exactly right, as there were no other studios available. And he kind of goes on to elaborate a little bit more about like how they tried to make this work. And he says that I booked the studio in Toronto, and we had to find some place to rehearse. So we had this cinema that we go to at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was freezing cold. It was in the heart of winter there, really awful. He's not wrong. Being in Canada in winter is probably the coldest I've ever been in my entire life. I don't ever want to experience that ever again. The fact that people even live up there blows my mind. But anyways, he says that we'd be there trying to write songs during the day and go and record them at night. And kind of piggybacking on that, Geezer adds that Never Say Die was a patch-up kind of an album. People didn't realize that it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, that Never Say Die thing, because we knew that it was. We just knew it was never going to happen again. We just did this anniversary tour with Van Halen in 1978, and everybody's going, here's to another 10 years, and I'm going, yeah, sure. And, like I said, it is ironic that it's called that, but I think the band knew. And it's kind of, it's funny that they named the record this. Also, at the same time, Butler was also kind of really growing impatient with Osborne's criticism of his lyrics, in which he says that, I used to hate doing it towards the end of the Ozzy era. He'd say, I'm not singing that, so you'd have to rethink the whole thing. And even kind of, speaking on that, the lyrics definitely shifted a lot over the years. They weren't talking as much about political things like they were in the early days. They weren't talking about occult stuff really anymore. I mean, as you grow as a person, your ideas and things that you think of and want to write about are going to change. So it makes sense that he wouldn't want to change his writing style. But at the same time, I think he was also more than capable of still writing songs like the early days if he really wanted to. But he didn't want to, and it kind of sucks that Ozzy was like giving him shit about it. But I mean, this is just another thing that kind of was another crack in the vase, so to speak. And so here's a little funny story, a little anecdote that was going on like during the recording. Iommi is talking about like things that they would do. He says that we were all into silly games, and we were getting really drugged out. We'd go down to the sessions and have to pack up because we were too stoned. Nobody could get anything right. We were all over the place. Everybody was playing in a different thing. Ozzy kind of goes on to recount that with Never Say Die, they were all down on their luck, and we were just a fucking bunch of guys drowning in the fucking ocean. We weren't getting along with each other, and we were all fucked up with drugs and alcohol, and I got fired. It was just as bad as you think. You try to lift your head up above water, but eventually the tide sucks you under. And I mean, it's got to be a weird thing for him too. He's in this place where like he doesn't really want to go on with the band, and nobody wants to say that they want to keep him around, and they kind of don't want to keep him around, but they don't want to admit that either. The band is just in a really rough spot right now, and it's kind of one of those things where, like, maybe they shouldn't have kept going for at least a little bit after this. You know, they could have just taken a fucking break, but they didn't, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. But it just, like, it was a time bomb waiting to go off, and unfortunately, it really struck with this record. But, you know, even though this record is pretty divisive and it's a little all over the place, Bill Ward actually does defend the album quite often, in which he says that, in the circumstances, I thought we did the best we could. We were taking care of business ourselves. We didn't have millions from the record company. And despite the booze and Ozzy's departure, we tried to experiment with jazz and stuff the way we had in early days. You know, songs like Johnny Blade and Air Dance, I still like. But Ozzy vehemently disagrees with that, at least as far as, like, the jazz experimentation went. He calls the instrumental Breakout a jazz band going da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and I just went, fuck this, I'm off. And the bottom line was that Breakout was stretching it a little too far for me. With tracks like that on the album, we might as well have been called Slack Haddock, not Black Sabbath. The only impressive thing about a jazz band, as far as I was concerned, was how much they could drink. So obviously Ozzy was not a fan of the direction they were going. He didn't want to be a jazz band. He wanted to be Black Sabbath, you know, and I think that's a fair point, man. He was right. He was right. So while Butler was actually received credit for Swingin' in the Chain lyrics, they were actually composed by Bill Ward. And, you know, the problems with Ozzy continued, and, you know, Geezer and Bill would often be like, hey, either Ozzy goes or we go. And at that point, Bill Ward was becoming kind of the businessman of the band, you know, and he goes and he tells Ozzy, Tony Iommi wants to get rid of you. And so to this day, Ozzy thinks that Tony fired him, when really it was the other two that wanted him out. But also Tony wasn't really pleased with him either. And even then, you know, Tony talks about, you know, along with that in the album, mixing the album even caused my marriage to break up. As with Technical Ecstasy, everybody went on holiday when it came time to mix. My wife kept asking, how come you're the only one working while everybody is in bloody Barbados? So that, I mean, it didn't stop with just the band. You know, all the problems radiated out into their personal lives too, man. And poor Tony, you know, fucking lost a marriage over this record. How bleak, how much more bleak can things really get? And, you know, it's so unfortunate, man. A legendary band kind of imploding after 10 years of being a band. But, you know, despite that, man, in the UK, the title track, which was released well ahead of the album and the band's first UK picture sleeve single, did reach number 21 on the charts, and it gave the band its first Top of the Pop appearances in 1970. In the UK as well, the album itself reached number 12, one place higher than Technical Ecstasy, so in that respect, it did do a little bit better. In the US, it peaked at number 69 on the Billboard charts. And in the UK, Hard Road was released as a second single from the album and reached the UK Top 40. 25,000 copies were actually pressed in a limited edition purple vinyl. There was no picture sleeve release. But video for Hard Road was made during the Never Say Die tour to kind of promote this single. And that song marks the first and last time that Tony Iommi would sing backing vocals, in which Iommi explains that when he sang, bassist Geezer Butler couldn't keep a straight face. So it was clear that Tony Iommi was not made for singing, unlike everybody else in the band. Now, the band did go on tour with this record. They embarked on the Never Say Die tour on 16th of May in 1978 in Sheffield, with Van Halen as their opening act. And Van Halen just scored a hit in the U.S. with the cover of The Kinks' You Really Got Me. So Ward's drum tech, Graham Wright, and Osborne's personal assistant, Dave Tanier, write a lot about that tour, and they kind of reveal that relations between the two bands got off to a shaky start at a May 22nd show at the Apollo Theater in Manchester. Basically what had happened, after Sabbath finished their soundcheck, Van Halen hit the stage and started to play Sabbath tunes, and it was their way of paying tribute to Sabbath. But Tony Iommi was actually annoyed by it, and he may have misinterpreted the gesture as a piss take, which it certainly was not. Van Halen were in awe of Sabbath, and their lead guitarist, Eddie Van Halen, was a big fan of Tony. So the unwitting faux pas was actually kind of soon forgotten. The two bands came to get along together very well, and Alex Van Halen would often sit behind Bill's drum kit, watching and listening to him play on stage. And so on the American leg of the tour, Van Halen's presence had a major influence on ticket sales, since they were like a much bigger draw at home than they were in the UK. During which Wright and Graham recount two riots that occurred on the Never Say Die tour. The first happening in Neunkirchen am Brand in Germany, in front of a hall crammed with, quote, thousands of extremely stoned, drunk, and rowdy GIs. So basically what happened, 3 songs into the show, Iommi stalked off stage because of a buzzing from his guitar stack, and when the audience realized the band had quit the gig, they wrecked the hall. And funny enough, another riot ensued not very far from where I am located at this moment, at the Municipal Auditorium in Nashville, when Ozzy didn't show up at a show and the band had to cancel. And basically what happened, it later came to light that Ozzy had slept right around the clock, woken up, seen that it was 6 o'clock, and thinking that it was still the evening before, got ready for the show. And even more incredibly, he had been sleeping in the wrong room. So it was actually the day after the show. And, kind of one last thing here, talking about Ozzy leaving the band. And kind of talking about the album, he says, it's a combination of what we've all been through in the last 10 years. It's a very varied album. Like, we started it out playing in blues clubs because British blues like John Mayall and early Fleetwood Mac was the thing at the time. We were into a 12-bar trip and early 10 years after style stuff. So it was part of that sort of trip. Then there's the heavy thing and the rock thing. It's not just steam hammer headbanging stuff all the way through. We got rid of all our inner frustrations, what each of us individually wanted to put down over the years, but couldn't because of pressures of work. So we put a lot of painstaking hours into developing this album. However, a few years later, Ozzy kind of soured on the record. He changed his tune up, and he says that the last album I did with Sabbath was Never Say Die, and it was the worst piece of work that I've ever had anything to do with. I'm ashamed of that album. I think it's disgusting. And he went on to claim that the band flew to Toronto in January during the sub-zero temperatures purely because the Rolling Stones have recorded a live album there. And Ozzy also later said that, I'd go down to the studio and I heard what sounded like a jazz band playing, and I think, is this really Black Sabbath? I'd just fuck off. And so Ozzy was fired by the band 8 months later. And so I'm going to play a quick clip here of Ozzy talking about being fired and the subsequent time after that. And we're going to go on to our final album after that. And we'll be right back.
The day I got fired from Sabbath was at the time the worst day of my life, but then looking back now, it probably was the best thing that ever happened to me and them. It was a very sad period. I remember leaving there. I locked myself in a hotel room for three months, just getting smashed out of my brains every day, That was the best job I ever got fired from, because they had a challenge. I mean, whatever I've said about Tony Iommi in the past was a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness on both parts. But I've got to be truthful to you. He's one of the greatest all-time riff merchants. I mean, he came up with some classic heavy metal riffs. The management we had never let us realise how big we were. I mean, we always used to think we were lower than Zeppelin. We were lower than, we were always we used to share rooms, for Christ's sake, for many years until we demanded our own rooms on the road. I mean, we ripped off ruthlessly. Sabbath just raped. And I said to my ex-manager, I like to be kissed when I'm getting fucked, you know.
All right, we are back from that. Kind of a little interesting take. That interview, I think, was a few years removed from all that, so he had kind of like softened up a bit with what had happened, and it was interesting to hear him talk about that. So we're going to go into the final record of this episode here, and this is leading up basically to the end of the 1980 era, and we're hopefully going to pick up the podcast after this going into 1980. So the final record is Heaven and Hell. It was recorded between October of 1979 and January of 1980, and it was released April 25th of 1980. Lineup for this record. This is where we get a huge departure here. I mean, everything is just changing up incredibly. We have Tony Iommi on guitar, Geezer Butler on bass, Bill Ward on drums and percussion, and Ronnie James Dio on vocals. As well as additional musicians, you have Jeff Nichols on the keyboards. And on the production side, you have Martin Birch, who produced and engineered it. You have Joe Foglia as an assistant engineer, Graham Wright and Mickey Balla with equipment, and the album cover was by Lynn Curley with the back cover illustration by Harry Carmian. Now, like I said with the lineup, you know, the only difference that everybody heard me say was Ronnie James Dio, but during the recording of a lot of this record, there's some gray areas as to who actually recorded what parts and who was in the band during what time. So while the final lineup is the quote-unquote classic lineup minus Ozzy, there's a lot of other things that happened, and we're going to get into that right now here. So Black Sabbath, like I said, they recorded this album between October and January, October 79 and January 80, so that's quite a big amount of time there. They recorded it at Miami's Criteria Studios again, where they had tracked Technical Ecstasy. They worked on the album with Martin Birch, and he's the one who encouraged them to like expand their sonic parameters and experiment with structures that really suited Dio's multi-octave voice a lot better. And obviously, the results were beyond what anybody could have expected. They were astonishing. They were amazing. I mean, to think that this is Black Sabbath in 1980 fucking blows your mind, man. And I know there's like that weird rift of like, Dio era isn't Sabbath. Well, fuck that. It's as much Sabbath as any other fucking record they put out. Dio is such an amazing vocalist that you can't take away what he did with this band, and you can't take away what the band did with him. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So before we kind of go on with that, I'm going to play kind of a long clip. I think it's between 10 minutes and 15 minutes maybe of Dio talking about how he got into Black Sabbath. I'm sure some of the information that I have I'm going to kind of repeat afterwards, but it'll be cool hearing it from Dio himself in an interview. And I'm going to play that, and we'll be right back.
Well, it all really started with a conversation I had with Tony on the phone at a time when he was about to leave Black Sabbath, and was introduced to Tony by then Sharon Arden, who, of course, Sharon Osborne, Ozzy's wife. And one thing led to another, and was invited into the studio that they were using. Tony said, well, I want to play something for you, and so they strapped on their instruments and they played me the beginning of what was a song called They Became Children of the Sea. Could you do anything with this? I said, sure, give me a few minutes and I'll see what I can do. Put something together. I sang the song, we did it. Tony at that point said, I want to play with this guy. And that was the very beginning of it all. In Tony's case, because we had spoken on the phone, I felt I had some connection with him. But I'd never met Bill before. I'd never met Geese before. Met Billy that night, the night I told you that I went to the place where they were rehearsing, and instantly fell in love with Bill. Just the sweetest, sweetest man I think I've ever met. A lovely guy. And Geezer's Geezer. He was, you know, very low-key and a bit standoffish for me, because I'm not a standoffish person, and Tony's not standoffish, nor is Billy. But, you know, that just happened to be Geezer's personality. You know, once you get to know him, you find out that's not what he is at all. So I didn't really have that much of a personal connection with them. So that was my first knowledge of them as people. And again, that's why it took me a while to make that decision. Do I want to do this? Because I didn't really know them as people. Do you want to go into a situation that has not been successful for a while? Because there must have been reasons why it wasn't successful. And did I want to make myself part of that unsuccessful pattern? So I thought about that a little bit, but it wasn't that for me. It was never that for me. It's never been about that. It's always ever been about the music and the people that I'm playing with. People first. If I don't like them, I don't want anything to do with them. So that was a consideration, and musically, of course, was a consideration as well. But in starting to write the things, just that particular night, I mean, I loved what Tony's ideas were. I loved where he was coming from. Well, I think the most devastating thing was that 2 or 3 days after we had decided that we were going to do this together, and Ozzy was now not going to be there, Geezer left. And so suddenly it was just kind of Tony and Bill and myself. So it made it a lot more difficult. I mean, I thought we were all, you know, a band with a bass player and a singer and a guitar player and a drummer, and it was just going to go smoothly. But who knew whether he was ever going to come back or not? And at that point, we didn't think he would. But Tony was still very positive about it. Bill was very positive about it. So we started to do some more writing. Then we brought another bass player, and I suggested Craig Gruber, who had played with me before, who was a fine bass player. He came in to play and stayed with us all the way through going to Miami to record the album, at which point Geezer called Tony and said, you know, I'm really miserable. And if you think you guys would want me back again, I'd really love to come back again. And so Tony approached me and said, Geezer called, and whatever you think, Ronnie. And I said, it's not the same without Geezer, of course. So Geezer came back, so that made life easier. But it was a lot more difficult before that, because we were now writing almost without a plan. We were just writing. Is that good? Well, I don't know. Sounds good to me. It's nicer when you have all the parts of the puzzle together, because then you can make those judgments together. I think we were probably all a little bit afraid of what it was going to be. Well, will it be accepted? We don't know. We would go to the local strip club after we'd record one of the songs. We'd go to the strip club, and they would play it, and the strippers would dance to it, and if they liked it, we knew we had a good one. Did Heaven and Hell, they loved that. Oh, they just absolutely loved that.
The song
one.
Heaven and Hell.
Oh, they loved that one. They couldn't wait to dance
That's
to
a
that
long
one.
dance.
Yeah, but they loved it. And all the rest of the songs we brought in, they loved as well. And so it was a great way for us to gauge what was going on. But I think we were all a little bit afraid, is this going to be accepted? And we were so lucky that it was right from the get-go. And everyone who heard it said that too. This is brilliant. But I don't think we ever wanted to take the chance of believing that, because we didn't want to be let down by that. But again, in retrospect, the hindsight is a wonderful thing. Yeah, boy, we knew it was going to be a smash, but we know we didn't know that.
Okay, so hopefully, I don't repeat too much of that information, but it's going to get repeated no matter what, and I think it was just cool to play it anyways. So kind of how this all came about with getting Ronnie James Dio in the band was that Tony actually bumped into him at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, and he invited him back to the studio for a jam. And not even the expedient composition of The Children of Sea was taken as an omen for Black Sabbath's rebirth, because after all, Geezer was so set against continuing on without Ozzy, and also dealing with like a divorce, that kind of at times bass playing duties were actually handled by Jeff Nichols. So that's why, I say that Jeff Nichols is credited as a keyboard player, but he kind of took up the mantle of bass player during the recording sessions, and it's fair to give him his due. So basically what had happened with that, Iommi says that we had him come over to our house in Beverly Hills, and I played him a riff, and he just started singing to it, and we went, bloody hell, this is fantastic. I think that was a little more Australian than British, but that's okay. So he continues on. He says that we didn't audition him as such. We just started writing, and it was a different way of working for me, which was very refreshing because always before with Ozzy, it was about riffs, and Ozzy would sometimes sing the riff. But with Ronnie, there were more chords than actual single note riffs. And, in addition to working well together with Dio, him and Iommi had a lot of common interests and got along like right from the start, in which Iommi says that it was like we'd known each other for years. I was very impressed with him. He came in with a great sense of humor, and he was obviously used to working with a lot of English people anyways, so he knew all the slang words. He fit in very well. And, as jarring as it is to have Dio on a Sabbath album, there's something about this record that it just fits so fucking well. I mean, from the opening track, when you hear Neon Nights hit, it's just like, fuck yeah, I'm in, man. I'm in. Like, you can call this Black Sabbath, you can call it whatever the fuck you want, man. It's so good, man. It's just got a good energy about it. It's not quite early Black Sabbath. It's not doomy. It's not stonery, but man, it's got some power to it. That's for sure. So like I mentioned earlier with Nichols kind of writing a little bit on this record, it was actually him, in fact, who accidentally sparked the proceedings to the next level when he recycled as a distinctive hypnotic bass line from one of his old band songs, Mainline Riders. And it was a bass line so simple that Geezer later admitted he would have never thought of to play it that way. And so that would eventually become Heaven and Hell's title track. And despite briefly considering a name change to just plain Sabbath, eventually when Geezer came back and when Bill Ward's availability kind of opened back up, they stuck with just Black Sabbath still. So, and the reason for this, Bill Ward was kind of in an alcoholic stupor most of the time, and Geezer left a few days into songwriting to kind of sort out, his personal issues. So that forced Iommi and Dio to hire a couple of fill-ins while they finished writing. And Dio kind of recalls, he says that Geezer was only there for a couple days after I arrived, so Tony and I wrote everything. We went to Florida with another bass player to start recording, and in the middle of it, Geese called Tony and said, "I'd really like to come back. Is there any chance?" And I didn't think it was working that well with the other bass player we hired anyway, but I felt it was important that Geezer play with Tony, so it was a no-brainer. Geezer came back down, and that was another tribulation to have to deal with because he wasn't exactly in the best headspace at the time. So, the band's really, really trying hard to stick together. They're not giving up on their members, unlike, Ozzy, who kind of seemingly just ditched in a way. These guys are obviously dealing with a lot of personal life stuff, and I don't know exactly how old they are at this time, but I would have to think they're in their 30s at least, maybe mid-30s, I'm not exactly sure. And that's a really, grown-up time. You have to, take care of families and do all this other stuff. So the fact that they're contending with all that while trying to write a new Black Sabbath record is very commendable. But even with that, Dio, Iommi, Butler, and Ward got super serious about demoing and rehearsing the new songs in LA before they moved to Miami. And there they met up with legendary hard rock producer Martin Birch, who worked with Deep Purple and Whitesnake, and they got down to business, man. Apart from the recruitment of Dio, like I said, the other big change was using this producer because he was like the first outsider to work with the band since Roger Bain in 1971, because the band kind of took care of everything else after that. And so speaking to that, Iommi says that we felt that bringing someone in could really help focus the ideas, and it was Ronnie who'd recommend Martin as they'd worked together in Rainbow. What he brought in was an extra dimension to the songs, and we also recorded very fast. The whole process went so smoothly. We've been used to taking longer and longer to record with things getting out of hand, but this time it was a joy to be in the studio. And, I still think they took a long time to record this record, because if you look at the fact that it was like October, November, December, January, almost 4 or 5 months to get through this thing, that's a long time. you know? I mean, compared to like what they did in the early days where they would bust it out in like a day or two and then, you know, a week. And now they're taking like 4 or 5 months to get a record out and recorded. You know, they call it quick, but really it's not quick to them. You know, they know that. But that's okay, man. I mean, they're on their dime at this point. They can take however long they fucking want. And so, you know, the fans themselves had to kind of contend with the fact that Ozzy also was no longer in the band. So the band had to kind of deal with the fans' doubts of moving forward with Dio. But really, Iommi definitely had no fears about it. He was pretty much on board from the moment they, you know, tried him out. And he says that it was all so exciting and challenging. We were doing things that, quite frankly, would have been beyond us with Ozzy. He wasn't that sort of singer. But with Ronnie, there was so many more options. It really did feel like we were starting all over again. And we all knew when the album was finished that it was something special. It felt right for the time and was Black Sabbath as people had never heard us before. And I think he makes an excellent fucking point there, man. This album feels so right for its time. You know, it's right in the beginning of the 80s and the metal landscape is about to just fucking change so drastically, not only from year to year, but month to month. You're going to start seeing Iron Maiden, you know, all these melodic bands pop up, you know, Judas Priest, you know, obviously Van Halen, the list goes on and on. It's just going to change the landscape from here on out, and the band was right on the pulse of that, and I think that this record is perfect for its time, and he sums it up perfectly in that quote, so it makes sense, man. So with that, you know, despite their enthusiasm for the songs they were writing, the label was quite skeptical that anybody would be interested in the band without Ozzy, so they refused to pay for the recording. So the band funded everything themselves, and, you know, with time kind of burning a hole in their pockets, they worked more quickly than they were used to, which meant less personal indulgences. And kind of speaking to that, Iommi says, we couldn't possibly operate at the level we were used to. We had to be focused and work quickly. Having said that, we had our days when we would dabble a bit, but we didn't say, right, we're going to do an album. Let's do tons of drugs and drink. You know, so just because Sabbath didn't party like coke fiends like they used to doesn't mean that there weren't some crazy shit that happened while they were working on this record. Pretty much when they would finish a track, they'd take it to the local strip club and the DJ would play it while the girls danced to it. And so even at one point too, Iommi actually set Bill Ward on fire as a part of a prank they had pulled a dozen of times. The only problem is that this time Bill Ward got badly burned and kind of fucked him up pretty bad. And so another thing, Tony Iommi found out that Dio was like deathly afraid of snakes, and I'm right there with you, Dio, R.I.P. I hate snakes too, man. So that left the door open for another joke that he played on him, in which he says that, man, this is so fucked up too, this would freak me the fuck out. He says, I found a dead rattlesnake, so I tied it to a bit of thin fishing line and put it in his car and tied the other end to his door handle. So when he opened the door, the snake jumped towards him. He wasn't very happy about that, so the next thing I knew, I went to the loo in my room and there's a snake down my toilet. Oh, man, that's so fucked up. I would be way more pissed if that had happened to me. But at least Dio kind of got him back, putting the fucking dead snake down his toilet. Oh, man. You know, the other thing, too, Iommi kind of talks about with writing this record, he says that the band was kind of writing out of sheer stubbornness. You know, everybody was wondering what was going to happen and what it was going to be like and was it going to work, and that the band just believed in what we were doing and carried on with it. So, you know, even kind of going off that, Dio says that when they finished and played the songs for everybody, it was like real vindication. You know, everybody who had originally doubted us was suddenly saying, all right, I'm hopping on this wagon. And, Sure enough, man, when it was released, Heaven and Hell went to number 28 on the Billboard album chart, and it did eventually go platinum. It's their first platinum record in a long time for their releases. And, more importantly, it proved that Sabbath didn't really need Ozzy to remain a force of nature in the heavy metal scene. They took a chance here, and it paid off. It paid off pretty well for them. The band did do a tour on this record, and it went okay. I think, unfortunately, just a few months into the tour, Bill Ward bailed out on the band to kind of cope with his substance abuse problems and also the death of his parents. So that led to Vinny Appice taking over the drums, and he was there for the recording of their following records for a little bit. But that also would accelerate kind of a deteriorating relationship between Dio, Iommi, and Butler, unfortunately. But then again, Dio would go on to do a solo career in 1983, and unfortunately, Black Sabbath's career once again fell into disarray, and they wouldn't even really fully recover until like the mid-90s when they reunited with Ozzy. Not even the rare peaks and valleys they experienced during the years between could really erase the memory of this album and just like how astonishingly creative this record was. And it's kind of unfortunate that this was, they did Never Say Die, which is just a mess, and then they do this amazing fucking album to try and like keep the band together and maybe turn a new leaf and keep it going, and then it implodes again, man. It sucks. But even then, it's still regarded as a classic in their discography. I hold it very highly up there in terms of like their records personally. Like I said, I don't care about the Ozzy Dio shit. Like, it doesn't matter. It's good. That's what matters. But Iommi, in talking about the record, kind of in hindsight, he says that I believe it stood the test of time remarkably well and helped to reinvent the band. As far as the songs go, it's amongst the most musical records of our career, right up there with the very best. Yes, I know there are people who still maintain that Black Sabbath is all about Ozzy, but there are others who got into us through hearing Heaven and Hell. People like Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters and his generation first heard Sabbath on this album, and from there, they discovered our past. So it's played a huge role in giving the band a long career. And I couldn't agree with him more. Different eras are going to attach themselves to different records, and this one just happened to hit a certain era as metal was changing. So I think his point is very right that it gave the band a longer career. And so the last thing we're going to kind of close out with here, I'm going to talk about the cover of this record, because the band's had some very sordid record covers, like I talked about earlier in this episode and the previous episode. But this one was a good record cover, and especially for Dio himself, everything about this album was very vital, and especially the cover. So speaking on that, he talks about kind of how the cover came to be, and he says that we knew the artwork had to make an impact. What we liked about Lynn Curley's illustration was that it showed three angels seemingly relaxed by doing what normal people might do, smoking and playing a friendly game of cards. They were just taking a break from the job. It's kind of like everyone looking at the cover of Abbey Road by the Beatles and believing Paul McCartney was dead for certain reasons. There's too much being read into what is a straightforward painting. The three characters aren't meant to be members of the band at all. And so, kind of funny enough, about 4 years later, Van Halen used a similar approach for their 1984 album, except they only had one angel, and it was a little more childlike, obviously. And Dio kind of makes comments about that, and he says that, I'm sure that they got their inspiration from what we did on Heaven and Hell, but whereas our angels were rather natural and certainly not threatening, I found the 1980 cover a little too perverse. And the band does appear on the cover, but only on the back of it as an illustration by Harry Carmian. He's a veteran American artist who used inspiration of the old masters to depict Dio, Iommi, Geezer, Butler, and Bill Ward in an iconic fashion. So what Dio says about that, he says, "I liked what he did because we look slightly heroic. An album is about more than just the music. Heaven and Hell as a package is perfect. A lot of this is down to the sleeve as well as the music we made." And so with that, listeners, that concludes the first 2 episodes of Heavy Metal History, covering the Black Sabbath years up to 1980. I hope you guys will dig this podcast and what we have to come in the years. If we can keep the podcast going, you never know what may happen. And I really hope that, I can bring some good content. We're going to probably go on into 1980 from here, and then we'll see how we feel after that. I got some interviews lined up possibly coming soon, and, just kind of getting closing thoughts on Black Sabbath here, the first decade, 2 decades or so of the band. I mean, they changed the whole landscape of music, and especially heavy metal, by really just being a product of their time. These guys, I don't want to use the word angst, but they did have a lot of angst starting out, and they used that to create something that didn't exist in the world before them. And for that, as long as this stupid ball in the middle of space exists, people are always going to know Black Sabbath, and they're always going to know that they started heavy metal. And I think the band will never be lost to time in that respect. So they're legendary in their own right. They will always be legendary, and it'll be a sad day when one of them passes away. Obviously, musicians die all the time, but the day somebody from Black Sabbath dies, that will be the day heavy metal dies in some respects. So once again, I'm your host, Dustin. Thank you so much for listening and checking out the Heavy Metal History podcast. Until next time, just remember,
Be excellent to each other and